So today we are going to be looking at World War I in the United States. Going to just really briefly mention the issues in Europe because that was gone over a little bit before, but just to make sure that that's clear in the process, and then we'll get into what was going on with the U.S. and our involvement in the whole thing. So if let's not select that again, sorry. So if we start with looking at the alliance system that had taken over in diplomacy in Europe, you had the Triple Alliance, which was made up of, each one had three main countries that played a part in it. So you have Germany, right, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Now, of course, you also have the colonial influences and spheres that went into it as well. So while you have these alliances, the Triple Entente was the other one, and they were the main, can basically consider the great powers that we talked about with Europe. Up to that point, they all, or almost all of them, had colonial powers as well. And so when they get into war, you're going to have those colonial spheres that are also going to fight. And this is then what brings it into even more of a world war structure than just these 6 countries, let's say, which would still be a really large war, don't get me wrong, but you not only have them, you have all of their colonial influence and spheres and their colonies that get drawn into it whether they want to or not. And so with the alliance system, how it worked was it was meant to be a safeguard, with the idea that if you had alliances, it would provide protection and people would be less willing to invade or attack one of these countries, because if they did, the agreement is that the others in the alliance would come to the aid of the one attacked. Then this, what we talked about last time, of course, within this system is you have, well, let's put that as 2, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, which kickstarts off this whole process and all of that. And when then they declare war, right, this is a domino effect of declared war, of declaration of war. Then the last thing that we looked at, of course, in Europe was, we'll say, European mentality, although it's safe to say that the U.S. had some of this as well, but it was stronger in Europe for sure. You had nationalism and jingoism, which, if we recall, jingoism was connected to extreme dislike, if not hate, of other countries. You wanted to see them fail for the success of your own. And that had been boiling for a while. And so this wasn't brand new, but rather you had extreme nationalism, support of the country and pride in your country, and then that evolved into jingoism, because of course you had new technology that we looked at that was aiding in the spread of nationalism and jingoism, competitions, diplomacy, things like that. And then you also had war as a celebration. The idea that it was exciting to go to war was something that was a positive, something that was an adventure. It was definitely, there was massive romanticism of warfare. And that's going to be shattered with the harsh reality of the type of war that World War I becomes. So that was what we talked about this some, so I'm going quickly over this part, but that is what you had: the great powers, the alliance system, the colonial powers with imperialism, all bringing in a bunch of different people. And then you had the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which was the catalyst for the domino effect of everyone declaring war on everyone. And then the European mentalities that helped bring that to light with nationalism and jingoism. And when we watch the warmonger poems is a really great example of just that type of jingoism that was being taught to kids, let alone within the country itself. New technology with photography, books, you have the telegram, things that were able to transmit these ideas and stories and publish that people were following, and keeping close contact about, what their country was doing. And then just the people celebrated when they heard the news that their country was going to war. The type of war that World War I embodies is trench warfare. Trench warfare was very different. This was a new type of warfare. This was not how war had been fought in the past. And then on top of that, we still had, again, new technology and weapons that is going to somewhat clash with the trench warfare system and is going to create massive devastation and death. And not all of the countries were prepared for this level of warfare. The reality is that France, probably most out of any of them, was still trying to fight the more traditional warfare where you met on the battlefield face to face and attacked each other. But now you had a completely different system within the trenches. So, and then new technology. Here, we'll put on here the specifics. Weapons, the Gatling gun, which is like an early machine gun, gas warfare we'll look at as well. Both which were devastating as well as psychologically devastating in that process as well. So the structure of the trench. You often were fighting battles in the past. You would fight for large swaths of land, and battles as far as what was seen as being won or successful was the more territory you were conquering, was kind of this definitive thing of, yeah, we are winning. We are, taking new areas and being successful here. And in trench warfare, you often were fighting over a mile of land that you could be fighting over for months. So small amounts of actual territory, which was psychologically devastating to many people who felt like that there was no progress throughout this whole period. And so you would be fighting and thousands of people would be dying in your unit. And what had you accomplished at the end of that? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe you didn't even take the land. Maybe you did, and it was a mile. And so it felt like nothing was happening but death in that process. The other thing with it is that it was close combat. So while you were in the trenches, you could essentially yell and hear the other side. Sometimes you didn't even have to yell. So you were hearing the other trenches. They were that close in that. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of boredom that takes place. There was a lot of waiting in between these short bursts of action. The trenches could be incredibly elaborate to, quickly done. How you kind of worked here, we'll do an awesome diagram here with this, is that you had, let's say you had trenches on either side here. And then There would be barbed wire on either side. And then this was no man's land. And it was no man's land because everything was devastated. There would be large holes throughout no man's land, stumps of trees, if anything, because this whole area here was constantly shelled. Let's put that up there. There we go. And so that they would send shells before any attack. The other side would try to shell the other side. Ideally, right, they were trying to get into the trenches themselves. A lot of times, though, it ended up in no man's land instead. Then what you would do is, it was called over the top when you charged. The French, I mentioned, were ineffective with this because they had their out-of-date uniforms that were from previous wars that were very brightly colored. And this type of warfare, that just made you easy targets. The French suffered a lot of losses because they kept charging over the top. Everyone did at the beginning of the war. Other sides began to make different changes in tactics of how they did trench warfare, but the French held on to this way of sending all the men over the top. But if you do that when you charge, you end up in no man's land, and this is a death zone. This was where the other side, just waiting here, could snipe you, could have Gatling guns, and it would become a complete slaughter. If you were lucky and got enough people into the trenches, right, then they could take people out. But a lot of time they retreated before they even got to the other side. Often they would start trying to create trenches off to the side to then make an attack this way slowly because that was safer. But the earliest type of warfare was to go over the top. And even when they started doing these alternate methods, there was still over-the-top advances. And the hope was, of course, that the shelling had devastated this area, the trenches and stuff, before you charged. Most of the time, not enough. Maybe a little bit, but not enough. You'd hunker down, and both sides experienced that, where you would get shelled even when there weren't going to be attacks, but a lot of times it was been preceded with an attack. And you just hunkered down and bunkered into bunkers until the shelling was over, and then expected a charge. And so while this would kill some, it wasn't sufficient in what they were really hoping to do in the long run with the process. And then what they would also do at night is they would send scouts, and so you'd crawl out here and try to hear better what the other enemy was doing and planning. There are occasions when scouts would run into each other, like in the craters and stuff, and you had to make a decision, right? You didn't want to fire your weapon, your gun, because if you did, everyone would start shooting and both of you would guarantee to be dead. You could fight with a knife and hope that you come out alive, or you could both agree to turn around and nope it out of there and go back, which a lot of times that's what they did. They'd see each other, be like, never mind, and turn around and head back to and try again later. And that was the way that it was fought with that. And this was devastating. It was completely a high kill zone rate. If you got left out here, if you fell during an attack and you weren't dead, most of the time people wouldn't be able to get you. You couldn't even have medics that were designated as such. If they went over, if you peeked your head here, if you peeked your head over the trench, you were shot at. This was a dead giveaway to be shot at. And even medics who would try to go out and get to the wounded and dead would be shot at. So if you ended up wounded in the middle, you usually just were left there until you died. And then the soldiers had to sit here in the trenches at night, listening to the moans and dying breaths and anguish of the people dying out there, knowing that they couldn't get them, even if sometimes they were really, really close to the edge. So if they weren't able to be brought back, or you weren't able to crawl yourself back, but with the retreat, men were just left out here. And so it was just this horrendous psychological component, notwithstanding the trenches themselves, which were often pretty horrible conditions. You had, we'll look at some pictures in just a minute, but you had, with conditions and stuff that way, there often was standing water. And what this led to was called trench foot, which led to gangrene if you didn't change and dry your feet constantly. Lice was a constant problem. They apparently had rats the size of cats that hung out in the trenches and ate on dead bodies. The dead often were that died in the trench itself were just remained there until there was a shift of who was coming in and out. You also, of course, went to the bathroom nearby. Now, you didn't go right, like this person didn't go to the bathroom right here, but you would dig a side trench, and that would be the latrine, and it didn't help, you know, there was smell coming out of that, notwithstanding dead bodies, standing water, lice, you know, not a lot of food. There was also, I mentioned the boredom. There was a lot of downtime where you weren't fighting, you were waiting. And so, of course, during that time, you could eat, you could sleep if you could. There was a whole thing called trench art that took place that they made with shells, mostly, with the larger shells. Candlesticks were a big one that was made, but other trinkets and things that way, just to pass the time, to waste away the time. This also created, of course, what they didn't call it that, they call it was PTSD. They called it shell shock. And many people went crazy and lost their minds in that process. One way that individuals got out of it is that they would not raise their head to get their head blown off, but you'd raise your hand, right? And either during the day or with a lighter, and then a sniper would shoot it, and then you would be medical leave, you'd be removed from there. They were supposed to have rotation every month, and that did not happen. And so this also led, make sure you say did not happen, this led to increased shell shock and issues because of that. So let's look at a couple things with this. This website here just talks about the death and rat infestation, lice, fever. I didn't put that one right. You have trench fever. Oops. Here we go. Where did it? Trench fever, lice, and then the trench foot I mentioned. And then the rats that were massive, and we're often afraid of them because of how large they were. Of course, there was some work like digging out the trenches and building up the trenches. But once they were built, a lot of times, like I said, there were small things to do, but there was also a lot of just free time in the process. The trench cycle, right? Typically, a battalion would be expected to serve in a spell on the front line. This would be followed by a stint spent in support, and then in reserve lines. A period of rest would follow, generally a short duration in the whole cycle. But of course, it was dependent upon the necessities of the situation, and they usually spent far longer in the front line than usual in busy sectors. It says that a man might expect in a year to spend 70 days in the front line with another 30 in nearby support trenches, 120 in reserve, and only 70 days of rest. You had also what's called the stand to and morning hate. The stand to was an hour before dawn, and everyone got woken up, and they ordered him to climb up the fire step to guard at dawn, the raids, in case there were raids. So that there were usually 2 times for raids, the early morning or in the evening, and so you would be woken up to be prepared for that. And both sides would get ready and prepared for these raids. Again, those are when they usually happen, but a lot of days you'd be prepared and nothing would happen. The company the stand as the light grew was the daily ritual of the morning hate. And this is where you would spend hours shooting machine gun fire and shelling small arms into the front. This wasn't super effective. It did get people occasionally. It was more something to do with the hope that maybe it impacted your enemy in the process. And then, like I said, you had the talks about here with the boredom on the front line, patrolling no man's land, which we talked about, and the smells and other and issues. I also have some images here, and if you want to see more, just Googling trench warfare World War I shows a lot of these. So you can see in the picture here over here, with this one has a wooden, oh, it's not gonna let me do it on pictures apparently. All right, well, the picture right to the right that's bigger, that's highlighted, it has the wooden support, and sorry, I clicked on it there. And then you can see where wooden parts are built up. It's got a couple different levels for them to look out, but it really did vary how deep they were. I mean, this was technically a trench, more like a ditch, versus some of the much more elaborate trenches. And it could be higher than standing. It could be crouching level. You could have these steps and supports. Here you have sniper holes where the soldier here has the rifle through a little hole which he could snipe. They're getting ready, it looks like, to throw a grenade. And here was a smaller trench, right? It was not, again, this was basic. So when you first came, the trenches were usually pretty small, and you dug just to do something quick, and then you built it up over the months and months of being there into more elaborate shelters. But it could be this as simple as if you stood over, right, that it wasn't very protective, to the much more deeper, elaborate trenches that were far more built up and had bunkers. And certainly some of the major battles that took, half a year to do would be quite significantly built by the end. Here you can see the water. That was just standing water that took place, that you had to deal with. And here they're taking care of trench foot, wrapping the feet, trying to keep stuff out of the water and keep you from getting gangrene. The other thing was, again, just having to live with bodies that would be nearby. There's a good one with standing water, and how much water depended, of course, on the day it rained. But this was trench warfare. This was life. This was how you fought, and it was awful, and it was brutal. Not only just, and again, the boredom and the diseases and things. You always had to get your hair shaved because of that, because of the lice and everything else. But it just the conditions were really, really terrible. And this played a massive psychological component. We'll look at gas warfare in a minute, because actually, let's do that first and then we'll watch the video. Gas warfare was the other thing. Oops, not there. Gas warfare was the other thing that was significant in playing a role in not only deaths, but more psychological components. Gas warfare was a new thing, and it was because of World War I that then it gets outlawed with the conventions on warfare. And it was meant, the goal of gas warfare was that by deploying it, it would kill off the enemy or incapacitate. And then by the time that you charged, that you would have very little resistance. And that would allow you to have less deaths on your side, ideally. Now, there were several different types of gas warfare. Mustard gas, chlorine were big ones. Each one had different smells and consequences and what complications. They were trying and continuing to search. The goal was ultimately one that would be unnoticeable, because if you could see it coming, you could prepare. So here were some of the problems with gas. One is that, as mentioned, a lot of them you could smell or see it coming. So this gave time for the soldiers to put on gas masks. The other thing was that if the wind shifted, there were more than one time where you ended up gassing yourself. So you throw it out there, it's going fine, and then the wind shifts back to you, and instead of gassing your enemy, you just gassed yourself, and it was the exact opposite of what you wanted. The other thing is that people learned, soldiers learned that you could just run through it to avoid more problems, right? If you hung around and stuck in it, this would cause more deaths and incapacitation. But if you saw that it was coming, you put on your gas mask and then you charge through it and attack. So this actually created attacks that they didn't want. And even if you were impacted, the impact of the gas often came too late, right? So that the battle already, because they then would charge to avoid the gas, it came too late in that process. You also had, it was more psychological. People were terrified of this because it wasn't something, not issues, it was psychologically effective. But in terms of tactically, it wasn't really. Yes, it caused some deaths and problems, but people were afraid. People were afraid because it wasn't something you could like physically defend against. You had to make sure you got your gas mask on properly and quickly enough. The Scottish, right, they had kilts. They actually switched to pants in the military because that left legs exposed, which got burned. And then, of course, the things that gas warfare caused were... you could go blind, you could have problems breathing, you get burns on your skin. So it was incredibly scary. In that sense, I guess that's where it was effective. The number of deaths it caused was far less effective. And because of all these problems and issues, they ultimately stopped using it partway through. But it was a new type of warfare that hadn't been tried before, and then gets banned as just war crime, basically, if you do use gas warfare even to this day, because it was seen as such a horrendous thing on people and not something that people could fight or do, and so it stops being used. But the World War I is definitely this war of trying new tactics and new things that hadn't been done before, and a lot of times it was a crazy mix of new technology with the Gatling guns and the older bayonet guns. And gas warfare and shelling, but also trench warfare and old tactics that all kind of mixed together. That's the best like connection of what trench warfare in World War I was, is that it was this coming together of old and new, and it didn't always mix well together. So what we're going to look at is a video. Now, this is from the Merry Christmas one, the French film I talked about that you could do for extra credit. I actually own this I bought it on YouTube, but it won't let me screen record it. They obviously have some technology if you've purchased the whole thing, that you can't see the video. But the free ones, apparently, you can show. The problem with that is this one that I found of trench warfare does not have the English subtitles on it. So the first part is in French. I apologize for that. If you are watching it for extra credit, then you'll see this scene anyway. that's okay. You'll still pay attention to the mood at the beginning before he orders them over the top, even if you're not understanding what he's saying. And then the rest of the fighting scenes with the no man's land and trench warfare that shows the brutality of it, nothing's being spoken during that time. And then the very last part's in English, but a little hard to understand, but it's not subtitled anyway. So I'll throw this up here, but I guess I actually need to go back for just a second. Nope, don't want to play on TV. Here we go. I have to pull this up to make sure you can hear it. Okay, we'll try this. I just realized I didn't select hear the audio, so there's a good chance when I play this I might have to splice it in with the audio from it after the fact, because I think it's going to be silent, but we'll play it anyways. It'll give me a space to set it in later if it doesn't work.
On a 100 mètres à franchir pour atteindre la tranche allemande. Depuis 1 heure, nos artilleurs pilonnent leurs mitrailleuses. Alors ça devrait bien se passer pour nous. On doit prendre leur première ligne, puis la ferme qui est juste derrière. Ensuite, le 134e viendra nous relever en fin de journée. Et on pourra retourner se reposer à l'arrière. On va être épaulés par les Écossais sur notre gauche. Vous les reconnaîtrez à leur calot noir. Ne vous occupez pas d'eux. Et restez attentifs à ce que moi je vous dirai. Je suis comme vous. Moi aussi je veux rentrer chez moi. Alors faites ce que vous avez à faire. Et dans 1 semaine, on passera tous Noël à la maison. Voilà. Advienne ce que devra. Baïonnette au canon! Approvisionné! Chargez! Come on, William.
Okay. So as you can see with the video, that not only was the main guy, he had to make himself throw up after just before they started, and then he was just basically giving them a pep talk for let's see, there we are, 5. The idea of you know, this is it, we get relieved soon, and you know, we all want to go home. I want to go home, I'm with you there. And then they'd have support with the Scottish troops, and then going over the top and immediately being shot at with a Gatling gun. The lieutenant guy that goes around to the side trenches, and all the guys get mowed down except for him. He's using them as shields and looking into the guy's face. And then those were 2 brothers, and his brother, that one brother's carrying his other brother on his back. And then his brother tells him he needs to leave, so at least one of them survives. And so he has to leave his brother, who is still technically alive at that point, in no man's land as people are getting blown up around. So there's more scenes and stuff of that, but that's a good one, that kind of an introduction of just kind of seeing, like I said, the emotional aspects of what they were going through, that the fact that they were stabbing people with the bayonets. It was close combat. It was psychologically devastating on so many levels. And created massive amounts of death. Millions of people died in the trench warfare. All right, so now we're going to look at the U.S. involvement and what went on there. Initially, the U.S. had the initial stance of neutrality. It was that we are neutral in this war. We don't want to get involved. And not just neutral, but also one of impartial, which none of this was. This was impossible. We could not be neutral and impartial in both thoughts and actions to that. In terms of, one, that you have a lot of immigrants that had ties to the various countries that were fighting, and then of course our connection to closer allies, which included Great Britain and France, that we were definitely more, we were closer to them than we were to other countries. And then you could also add trade to that. All of these things that the U.S. had involved in it meant that we were not neutral. And then specifically with Great Britain, our actions proved not neutral, because we continued to provide them goods, both which was just normal trade goods, as well as specifically wartime goods. Not provide goods. So it was trade, but it was also wartime goods. We provided them weapon parts. We wouldn't sell them full weapons, but we would give them weapon parts which they could put together to make the weapon, which was essentially, that was like a technicality. Oh no, we're not selling weapons. We're just giving you all of the parts so you can put your own gun together. But that's different somehow. And then we gave them money. And we became really a lender nation during this war, which is why it's going to have such an economic benefit to us, because of all of the money that's going to be coming back to you after that. The other thing, besides the statement and stance of neutrality and the impartiality, was that there was a very strong anti-war mentality or sentiment. Part of that had to do with the isolationist view. We want to be isolated. That's not our problem. You know, that's in Europe. That's not anywhere near us. Why is that something that we have to deal with or look at? That's all the way over there, so don't worry about it. That's not our thing. Europe versus US problem. We'll stay over here on our side. And, it was easier to be isolationist at that point, because while you are having the starter planes, there's not passenger commercial flights. Boats took months to get to Europe. You don't have the instantaneous kind of connection and communication that we have today. And so it just felt like we were really far away. So it wasn't a war that we needed to be part of. And even the president, with Wilson's slogan was for re-election was, he kept us out of war. So the campaign was on that. People were very anti-war. Women played a huge part in this anti-war crusade that was really part of the U.S. There was what was called the International League for Peace and Freedom. And this was a women's group that was created and was meant to protest the wars. They actually met in The Hague, at The Hague, during the war. These groups of women, and they talked about the impact of war on families and them, and on society, and agreed to meet again after the war. They also looked at what they could do to help with war efforts, but not for fighting. Instead, it was like they could aid, looking at promoting peace, diplomatic options, things like that. And so that was a big thing as well. So the problem is going to be, and we'll see, is that when the U.S. does eventually get into war, you have a whole population that's been brought up in the first few years of the World War with isolationist and anti-war movements. Now, there are several things that led us to actually being forced to get involved in war. The Lusitania was one of those. The Lusitania was a boat, and this is connected to U-boats, which were the early German submarines. This was also a new type of warfare, a new technology that had not been around before and that the ships didn't like. So the German U-boats had been effective, even though they were pretty primitive at the time, right? Because they could go unseen and break the British blockade, which the British had, up till this point, the best navy in the world. And so the U-boats, the Germans it was an attempt to circumvent that, and they were really successful. They sunk a lot of ships. So knowing that, going into that was part of it. Now, the Lusitania itself, it was technically a British passenger ship. And there had been a law that all ships over a certain size, including passenger ships and stuff that way, that they had to, when they had to either retrofit or build into it easy access to convert to a military ship. The idea being that in times of war, if they needed additional ships, they could have passenger ships that could be converted quickly. So what this led to was a visual look from the outside that from afar could be taken as a warship. And this is going to be problematic when the U-boats see it, because they had to have certain specific rings and gun mounts and some other things that were easily convertible that weren't in use when they were a passenger ship, but could be used, right, if it was confiscated. In fact, the Lusitania had a sister ship that did get taken and transformed into a military ship. Nonetheless, so the thing is, though, right, if you're looking at it far from binoculars or a periscope, the Lusitania on the outside would have certain characteristics that you would tick off to say that's a warship, not a passenger ship. The other thing had to do, though, with, of course, just bad choices in that process. So this happened on May 7th, 1915. Not 11. So talking and writing here. There we go, 1915. It was in New York. And it was going from New York to Britain. And it was taking passengers. The German embassy had taken out an ad in the newspaper, which warned people not to get on this ship. It basically said, like, if you get on this ship as a passenger, one, it's going into a war zone, and two, there is a chance that we might sink it if we see it. So the Germans did warn in the newspaper that if they saw the Lusitania, that they might sink it. The problem is that there was a ton of propaganda, anti-German propaganda at this time. And even with them saying, right, they basically are saying, don't get on this boat. It's a bad idea. You know, don't get on this boat. Only one person canceled their ticket after the ad was published, because there was so much anti-German propaganda that many thought that this was just propaganda, that this wasn't something that was real, and they ignored it and didn't see it as a massive problem. There were 197 Americans on board. There were lots of other passengers than that, but 197 Americans. You had the captain of this ship was partly at fault for what happened. Captain Turner, he was ordered to zigzag when they got closer to the Britain and the German lines. The reason for this is that U-boats are not super sophisticated at this point, so it was harder for the U-boats to be able to target and hit if you went in a zigzag pattern. It would have been very difficult to do. Well, he ignored this and just went in a straight line. So it made them an easy target for the U-boats. And the Germans sank the ship. Now this whether there's lots of debate whether they knew that the Lusitania was a passenger ship. I mean, obviously they warned about it, but the German embassy and government warning and a U-boat captain and crew knowing this is the same boat, especially with the technology back then, that's not necessarily guaranteed. The Germans also knew that there would be serious consequences if they killed Americans. At this point in time, we are not in the war. They don't want us in the war. That would not be good for Germany, because we're obviously not going to ally with them. We're going to ally with France and Great Britain. Those are our closest allies. And especially because if the Germans kill Americans, we're not allying with them anyway. And so it was better if the U.S. did not get involved, and they didn't want them to. So there was a lot of argument about, well, did they really intentionally sink a passenger ship with Americans on it? it didn't make tactical sense. Some argue that they did, and they were seeing what they could get away with. Some argue that they had no choice, because here's the thing. There was argument that the Lusitania was smuggling goods for Britain, including parts for weapons, in the hold of the ship. And if the whole point of the U-boats was to break the blockade by the British Navy. If they continued to allow these goods to go through, not only then would that not help with the blockade against them, but it would continue to allow goods, and that would allow Britain to continue to resist. They couldn't keep letting goods go through. And so the argument with some is, if there really were weapon parts on there, then they may have known and decided it was worth the risk, hoping that it wouldn't become too much of a problem. Over 1,000 passengers died, and 128 Americans died from the sinking of the ship. This obviously immediately caused problems with the US and German government. And there were some calls for war, but it's not as intense as it will be. So what ended up happening is you had a series of negotiations between Germany and the US, both looking to keep, Germany looking to keep the US out of war. The US, we still didn't want to go to war at this point. And so we were looking for it. So what they agreed to was reparations for U.S. family members of those that were killed. Right? So if there were Americans killed, they also offered an apology, a formal apology. They also did an admission of guilt. And then what was a cease and desist of U-boat attacks. This is what the U.S. wanted, and they went back and forth on these negotiations. They did offer reparations and apologies. They didn't do an admission of guilt, and they agreed. Okay, so here they did the reparations. They did an apology. From the cease and desist, they initially did what was the Sussex Pledge, which is that they agreed that submarines would announce their intent to sink the ship before they blew it up. Only on passenger ships, passenger and merchant ships. Right, so that doesn't apply to warships and things like that. Again, the problem with this is that it can be abused to where then you use these ships to transport military goods. And the British could use it as well, right? It's not just necessarily coming from the US in that sense. And so what eventually happens is that they eventually are going to break the Sussex Pledge. So this does not hold. It does for a little bit, but long term it doesn't, because ultimately it didn't make sense for Germany, especially when you think about the fact that it was too easy to have a loophole with this that hurt Germany. Now, the next thing was the Zimmermann Note. The Zimmermann Note was kind of like the final straw within that. The Zimmermann Note was a note from Germany. It was actually a telegram from Germany that was to Mexico. And it was intercepted by the US. So they didn't intend it to be, but the US got a hold of it. And the note essentially said to Mexico, it encouraged Mexico to invade the US. Basically, it was like, hey, Mexico, you know how the US, they totally came in California and Texas and New Mexico and stole your land way back in the day? Well, maybe we were thinking perhaps that you might want that back. And if you wanted that back and decided to invade just those areas, so they didn't encourage an all-out invasion. Instead, they encouraged them to take back their land that had been taken by the US. So if you wanted to invade California and Texas and New Mexico, not only would we totally understand, but we would support that. So basically they were saying they would support an invasion of the US by Mexico. This, of course, I mean, this leads to war. You can't you can't have that where the Germany is actively encouraging another country to invade you on top of the Lusitania and not have it lead to war in that process. So from this, you have a declaration of war, which is going to put us into war. The issue with this, I think we're on 3 there, is that you have a problem right from the beginning. Is that you had anti-war sentiment. People have been, for the better part of the entire World War, been saying in the US, we don't want to fight. We're not interested. War is bad. And the government was encouraging this. Again, wasn't raining on, he kept us out of war. Yay. And now you had to get people to do a 180-degree turn and support war. And some of that was easy because you had the Lusitania and you had the Zimmermann Note. But it wasn't an immediate thing. And many people were still very anti-war. So what they created was the CPI, which is the Committee on Public Information. And the CPI was the propaganda machine run by George Creel, and it had over 150,000 people working for it that they hired or moved and transferred from different government structures. And the CPI's goal, or mission, if you will, was to convince Americans to support the war. And this, of course, was the support the war financially, support the war. So with money in the military and the home front, they needed everyone on board to push a successful, war and do so. They created over 100 million pieces of literature, which could be posters, pamphlets. Posters were their number one thing that they did. There were thousands. They had newspaper articles and ads that they ran. You had flyers that went out and were everywhere. They also had 4 Minutemen, which they printed the speeches of these. They also did stuff on radio. The 4 Minutemen, they basically were on corner streets. And you would give a 4-minute speech on reasons why the war was justified, or why Germany was bad or whatever else. And it was extremely effective. It got most, not all, but it certainly got most of the U.S. behind the war. And we'll look at there were problems with it. So some of the main themes that came out of the CPI and propaganda was that America was a united moral community. Also, that it was idealistic and moral crusade for peace, the war, and the enemy as non-human, subhuman, and horrible. It ends up, what's interesting, it also was the war for civilization. That you were preserving civilization. These themes, what's interesting with this, these themes were not just in the U.S. Other countries adopted almost these exact same themes. World War I became the war for civilization. I actually have a World War I medal that was my great-grandfather's, I think. And everyone got this medal when they fought in World War I. And it literally says on the medal, the war for civilization. So they push this idea that, you needed to fight not only for peace and it was an ideal crusade, but to save civilization. And where we see this, where it's significant, was within the propaganda posters. So we're going to look at a few of the propaganda posters here. All right, got the PowerPoint up here. So we're going to look at the different propaganda posters here. And this was part of the discussion board assignment. But I wanted to kind of address some of the themes and things you see. So the first ones we're going to look at have to do with, just get the pen out here, have to do with enlistment. So the United States Army builds men. This one here, right, character, physique, crafts. It's the values and things that way. I'm doing my duty, are you? Your Navy needs you this minute. There definitely is a guilt trip in several of these. Right, this one is the attributes of being in the military. You know, how it's good for you, what it achieves. This one is a guilt trip, right? This person's doing their duty. Are you? Uphold our honor. This word gets used a lot. Fight for us. Join the Army, Navy, Marines. We're going to come back and look at women and how they're portrayed in a minute. But there we go. But so we'll come back to this example here. But anything that represents America tends to be shown as a woman. But here you have the honor, right? It's up to you. Protect this nation's honor. Again, honor. See, again, with the woman pointing at them. Here this, gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. So here is that guilt trip. But also like emasculation, like this girl wants to be in the Navy. Why are you not fighting as a man? And again, we'll talk more about how women are shown within that. These are all targeting men, and that's the key to think about too. Is who? So you want to think about within each of these propaganda posters, who is the poster targeting? With all of the recruitment ones, they're promoting and giving propaganda to men. Or to boys, right? So this is also to guys and stuff here. Destroy this mad brute. Enlist in the army. So here, anytime you see this pointed helmet, that's Germany. They tended to be called non-human names or derogatory of the Huns. Here, right, not human. This says culture. It's got blood on it, and he's stepping on, it's hard to see, but right here it actually says America. So he's stepping on America, has a club with blood on it with culture, and then a woman in distress, half naked. And so it was meant to show the Germans as not human, destroying civilization, right, as part of that. Come on. Go over. First call. I need you in the Navy this minute. Our country will always be proudest of those who answer the first call. Right? That guilt trip. You should feel bad that you aren't already over there. This a wonderful opportunity for you. Of course, in small letters it says down here, ashore on leave. But this one is that romanticizing of war. It's a vacation. It's fun. It's an experience, right? That's not meant, of course, only when you're on leave, but you know, they don't have to mention that. I want you for the Navy. Again, using a woman for that. Fight, okay, or buy bonds. Now we're going to be starting to move into bonds. War bonds were what you would buy that raised money for the US, and then you got back money with interest after the war. War bonds were something that had been done long term. I mean, this wasn't new. The Revolutionary War, they had war bonds. It was way riskier in the Revolutionary War, though, because there was no certain guarantee that the end of the Revolutionary War was going to end up with a United States nation of any kind. And so if during the Revolutionary War we'd lost, you got none of your money back. The war bonds were less a gamble here. Almost no one believed that the U.S. was going to lose and get invaded and stop being a country. But it was a way to loan money to the U.S. So you're going to have a shift here. This one's both, fight or buy bonds, which then they're trying to make the idea of the bonds as your way to fight and help out. The thing with this is that the fighting again, right? Fighting is going to the men. Bonds would be women and people who couldn't fight. So older men, younger kids, not like children that didn't have money, but you know, ones that weren't quite old enough to fight yet. So we're going to be starting to shift into a different populace of who they're promoting. Ammunition, and remember, bonds buy bullets. So again, it's this idea, he's got his hand stretched out, you're part of the fight. And these were definitely neutral. These were both to women and men that were on the home front. It wasn't one or the other. Help crush the menace of the seas. These were U-boats, right? Bloodied with a knife and dagger, killing people. The menace of the seas, again, subhuman, because their arms coming out of that. You can help, buy quickly, buy freely. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. Again, look at the way that they're portraying the enemy, non-human. This is someone that, you know, with bloody hands. Even the name, Hun, is in red, bloody dagger. So this is an enemy that's not civilized. It isn't really human either. His Liberty bond is paid in full. This boy has made his last great sacrifice. Are we, as Americans, doing our part in buying Liberty bonds? We can provide the money necessary to sustain and protect our other boys, and we must take his place in the trenches. Or who must take his place in the trenches. Let us do our duty and do it quickly. So this is a guilt trip, right? He died. What are you doing? Why are you not buying bonds? Uncle Sam, stamp out the Kaiser. Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. So again, it's that help, right? You're doing your part. The Liberty bond is stamping out, destroying the Kaiser. Halt the Hun. Third, Liberty loans. Again, you're helping. Look at the depictions. You've got three things here. The U.S. soldier in his stance, in this heroic, noble stance. and then you have the German soldier who is taking advantage of, we'll say, attacking a woman and child. Right? They're victims and in need. And look, he's got his sword, which they weren't really using swords. Here he's got a weapon, but instead of using the sword, he's just using his hand. Halt, stop, I'm noble. This one is the anti-immigrant sentiment. This one is, oh my gosh. So we'll talk about next time the massive anti-immigrant sentiment that gets into World War I and the U.S. Are you 100% American? Prove it. Buy U.S. bonds. So this is almost a threat. That's what's so crazy about this one, right? Two immigrants. You say you're American. Are you 100% American? Prove it. There's a whole thing with hyphenated Americans. And again, massive anti-immigrant sentiment that takes place at the home front in the U.S. And this is a very much a direct result on that, and was meant to be some of a threat because people were looked at with suspicion if you had any kind of immigrant connection within the first couple generations. And so this was like, look, you can prove you're 100% American by buying bonds. Joan Arc saved France. Women of America, save your country, buy war savings bonds. Again, this one even says to women. So portrayal, how does this woman come off? How does this woman look when it's two women? The key here with this is that, right, she's fighting. She's Joan of Arc, basically, right? In military, strong, a warrior, fighter, which is the opposite of, the only downside of picking this pen here is that it wants to highlight every time. I guess I gotta use that rather than my finger. Here we go. Victim, right? Victim. So you have women as victims. You have them as these noble but feminine. And then you have this, when it's to women, as a strong warrior or fighter. Now that we go into the next one, so we've had to get people to join the military, buy bonds, and then you have the home front with food, canned goods, Liberty Gardens is what they called them. They encouraged people to plant their own Liberty Gardens. And canned food, your own canned food. Food is ammunition. Don't waste it. The fruits of victory. Write for a free book, right? So here, canning your own goods. This is to women. And here you have the, she's patriotic. She's got this kind of dignified stance and all of that. Much different than the idea of the victim. Sow the seeds of victory. Plant and raise your own vegetables. Again, look at her stance. I mean, she's wasting. This is wasting seed. You should not plant seed this way. But it's an American flag, noble position, strong. Every garden, munition plant. So they have this still idea of that you're helping the war. You don't have to, be the one fighting or have the ammunition. But you're going to have strong, noble poses. Patriotic, right? That's when it's from two women, about women, that you see this push for how women are portrayed. Be patriotic. Sign your country's pledge to save the food. Again, leaning out, being patriotic. They shall not perish. American Committee for Relief in the Near East. Warrior woman. This was kind of like the Joan of Arc one. For you, they are giving their lives over there. For them, we must give every cent you can spare. This is back to guilt trip. Now, you also have the Red Cross. So we had the home front with canned goods and fundraising with Liberty Gardens and things like that. Here you have Red Cross depictions. This is still for money. But they show the Red Cross and what one of women's role as nurses, which was now acceptable role for women to be officially nurses. In the Civil War, women were unofficial nurses. By the World War I, women were officially nurses as part of the Red Cross. That played a significant role. And says, right, you're helping by holding up your end by giving money. The greatest mother in the world. So this is an injured soldier, but it's meant to look like Mary and Jesus. It has that religious connotation to it. And that's what the greatest mother in the world is. But it's also playing on women and that domesticity. But here we go. This one lays out what I was talking about with the civilization. Civilization versus barbarianism. I mean, so straight up laying it out. This is the U.S. and allies. This is Germany. What's interesting, right, is that Germany wasn't even the one that started the war, but they get the brunt of it. So the Germany and everyone else are fighting, they're barbarians. We're fighting for civilization. Wake Up America Day. This is meant to be Paul Revere. Well, the female, right? So is warning the U.S. about getting involved and being patriotic. So again, strong, patriotic part of the war. Okay, that was the last one. So you have what I wanted, hoping that you're picking up from this, and as you're going through and looking and see more, the way that women are portrayed, either as victims, as patriotic, as America itself, as strong fighters, or as this one, seductive, right? The other one was that too, which is not only a guilt trip, but it's meant to be somewhat sexual and seductive as well. There was another one I couldn't find again, where she's like in a nightgown, straddling a cannon. That would have been super risque for that time period. So you have both guilt, you can have multiple things with it, but the women ones is not only maybe guilt tripping and emasculation a little bit, but it's also meant to be this kind of sexual component as well. So the way that they portrayed women when they were using propaganda to men was very different than how they portrayed women when it was propaganda for women. And that also depended on what you have, as the main ones were the joining the military, war bonds, home gardening and canning, and then the Red Cross. Those tended to be the main kind of areas. And the home front wasn't just to women, right? They're the ones where they have propaganda in home front. How they portray people and women or the whole propaganda as a whole depends on whether it's for the general population, which could be both men and women in the home front, or whether it was just for women. So go back through, look at those, kind of pay attention to how those themes play out. How the enemy, right? How Germany, they're not seen as human. They're seen as destructive, subhuman, bloody, taking advantage of people, versus how, you know, the soldiers, U.S. soldiers are portrayed as these heroic idealists saving people. And then of course the blunt one that just says civilization versus barbarianism. And we're going to look at that anti-immigrant sentiment when we come back. Yes, let me gonna go out here. When we look at the next topic, we're gonna, because there's things with how the school structured it, how the school was structured, education of kids, laws that took place during this time, and the pushback against people who said, wait, I still don't support the war. That we'll be looking at more in the next lecture.